Hi everyone. I was very sad not to be able to come to the conference in person, so I just want to thank the team for letting me have this opportunity to do a video recording instead. On the bright side, I have actually saved 0.89 tonnes of CO2 by doing this instead of taking the plane, so that's pretty good. I think I've been introduced already, so I just want to say a few words about the Carbon Trust for those of you that don't know us already. We are an independent expert on climate change and green growth. We're mission driven, and our mission is to accelerate the move to a sustainable low carbon economy. And we deliver on that mission by offering advice and support to national governments, to businesses, to the public sector. We do it in a variety of ways. We offer support on certification, on footprinting, on implementation, on innovation and market analysis, and a whole host of other things. Perhaps most importantly, over the last 16 years, we've helped our clients to save 60 metric tonnes of CO2 and £5.5 billion worth of avoided energy costs. Our head office is in London, that's where I'm speaking to you from today, but we also have international offices, including in Washington DC, in China, Mexico, South Africa, and Brazil. So why do I want to talk to you about stakeholder engagement today? It's something that I feel very passionately about. I've worked on stakeholder engagement in one way or another for the last 15 years, and I really believe it's absolutely at the heart of getting anything done. I really cut my teeth on it working in Brussels, in the EU institutions and in advocacy, and that's somewhere where the importance of stakeholder engagement is only matched by its complexity. And complexity is an important point here, because the more complex your project, the more sophisticated your stakeholder engagement needs to be. And you don't need me to tell you that district energy projects can get pretty complicated. I get really excited about this topic because it has such make or break potential for a district energy project, and because it's somewhere where an organisation like the Carbon Trust can have a really big impact. I could spend all day happily talking about the principles and the theories behind stakeholder engagement, but I don't have all day, and I want to keep this session fairly practical, so I want to focus in on a couple of areas. Firstly, myths and assumptions that get in the way of stakeholder engagement happening as it should, and secondly, problem solving, so how to avoid and how to resolve some of the biggest problems that we see happening on the ground. So, myths and assumptions. In my everyday work on district energy projects, I see certain myths and assumptions coming up again and again. They're commonplace and they're incredibly unhelpful. In fact, one of the most important things to remember when you're doing stakeholder engagement is not to make assumptions. They are the enemy of good engagement. They get in the way of good listening, and they will usually lead you astray. The problem is compounded by the fact that the less people understand about stakeholder engagement, the more they latch onto the myths without questioning them enough. I have a very long list of them, as you may imagine, but today I just want to focus on the three that I think I see most often and which cause the biggest problems. So firstly, there's the myth that stakeholder engagement is all about getting the right key message to sell the project to your stakeholders. This is very, very wrong. Stakeholder engagement is not about selling, it is not about pitching. It is a two-way process. You need to listen to your stakeholders, you need to have a collaborative relationship with them so that they help generate the project. It's not about your project being sold to them. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about benefits with them, but they are benefits that you define together. It should never look like a pitch. Secondly, customers are only interested in the heat price. I hear this one time and time again. It is not true. Customers have a whole range of interests and concerns, and your job is to listen to them, find out what they are, and to be creative, to think beyond cost and find out what your project might be able to do for them that would solve some of the problems that they have on their desk every day. The other thing about assuming they're only interested in the heat price is that it encourages people not to engage early enough, and you actually need to engage very early to understand how to shape the project, to address their concerns, and even just to get the information that you need from them in order to model a heat price. So the third myth is external stakeholders are more important than internal stakeholders. So you should not take any of your stakeholders for granted, but certainly don't take the internal ones for granted. What often happens is that they're very prominent at the beginning, and then as the project progresses, they slightly fall by the wayside. These are people who you might need to approve a capital spend, to get you a slot on the agenda for a meeting, to get heat network connections discussed in a planning meeting, to coordinate when a road is going to be dug up. You can tell from those activities that they are going to be able to block your project just as effectively as an external stakeholder. So keep them front and centre of your mind all the way through the project development. Moving on to problem solving. Stakeholders are unpredictable, they're pretty complicated, so it's a fairly safe bet that at some point in your project something will go wrong. The important thing is making sure that it stays a setback and doesn't turn into a roadblock for your project. So I just want to take you through a couple of problems that we see time and time again on the ground and which cause particular problems. So one problem is a change in political administration. We all know that infrastructure projects take a long time to get to market, so it's pretty much inevitable that over the life of the project there will be a change in political administration, or at least a major political upheaval. You can't avoid it, but there are things that you can do to minimise the consequences. So for example, when you're developing the project, think about depoliticising the messages. So think about having different messages, different narratives for the project that will appeal to different people, not contradictory, but different. Even more effectively, think about having a headline message that everyone can buy into, that is not political, that is not controversial. A really good example of that was in London with Crossrail, where initial messages were around congestion. That was a little bit too political, so they shifted to messages around maintaining London as a thriving, globally important city. It was a place-based vision, which can be a very effective way of getting a message that everyone signs up to. When we were working with Bristol on their enterprise zone heat network, we helped them develop messages around delivering 21st century infrastructure. Not only was that less political than talking about reducing heat costs or reducing carbon, it was also much better for the businesses in that area that we wanted to connect to the network. The second problem is a communications crisis. As I mentioned before, stakeholder engagement means people. They're unpredictable, you can never really know what they're going to do. So I want to cover a couple of things here, a few tips for avoiding getting into the crisis, and if a crisis does happen, how to get back on track as quickly as possible and minimise the damage. So firstly, map your stakeholders. I think people generally know now that they need to do stakeholder mapping, but it's often not wide enough, so people get overlooked. You need to go really, really broad at the beginning. Anyone who might be affected by the project or have some interest in it. You can prioritise who you engage with. You don't have to engage with everyone you identify at once, but you need to know that you're there. Missing a stakeholder is a classic reason for ending up with communications problems. Secondly, listen. You need to hear what your stakeholders are saying to you. You need to keep an open mind. You need to not make assumptions. If you do, then you're likely to miss things that might come back to bite you later on. The other thing is that if people don't feel they've been listened to, if they have an issue, if they feel you haven't heard them, they'll go to someone else, and there are cases when that ends up being the press, which is not good. Pay attention to hostile stakeholders. It can be very tempting to try to ignore them, to hope that they'll come around, to hope that they'll go away. It's unlikely to happen. It's a very dangerous strategy. It applies equally to internal and external stakeholders. I've seen examples in the UK of both types going to the press when they've had issues with a project and not felt that the project sponsor has heard them. The other thing to remember about a hostile stakeholder is that if you can bring them round, they can become some of your most powerful advocates. If you do end up in a communications crisis, then don't panic, but don't ignore it and hope it will go away either. There are 5 crisis management principles that you can use in any situation. The first one is to be transparent. Bad press destroys trust or creates mistrust. You need to start rebuilding that as quickly as possible, and openness and transparency is absolutely key to building trust. Respond quickly. We operate on a half-second news cycle now, so if you don't respond fast enough, you'll lose the opportunity to influence the story. Thirdly, stay nimble. The first story that comes out is not necessarily the final story as it will develop. So make sure that you stay agile and you respond to developments in the story, in the narrative. And then fourthly, show accountability. So take responsibility for any mistakes that you've made, whether those are major mistakes or minor mistakes, and be authentic. Do not be afraid to apologize, but if you do apologize, you'd better make sure that you mean it. People are very good at spotting fake apologies, and it will make the situation worse. So that's all I have time to cover in this session. The topics that I've been talking about and various other things are covered in a stakeholder engagement guide that we've just produced for the UK government. It covers things like the theory and the principles behind stakeholder engagement, the tools and techniques that you can use, how, when and why to engage certain people at certain stages in a district energy project, checklists, troubleshooting guides, a whole host of things, and lots more problem solving, myths and assumptions. It's not yet been published, but if you're interested in hearing more about it, or if you would like to get in touch with me with any thoughts or questions on anything I've been covering today or more generally, please do get in touch. I think my contact details are available in the conference materials and on one of the slides that you've seen or that you're about to see, so I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.